Validations give us a way to make sure that data meets a set of requirements before it's saved to the database. You can think of them as rules that we want our data to follow. Now, we could validate the data each time a form is submitted. In other words, put that code in our controllers. But that makes it so that the only way to validate the data is to go through one of those controller actions. We wouldn't be able to globally ensure that our data always follows the rules. Plus, we'd end up repeating ourselves in other controllers that need to update the same database tables, and we don't want to repeat ourselves. Instead, with active record validations, we can define these validation rules in our model just one time, and then they become part of the intelligence of the model and can be automatically checked anytime the model goes to save the data to the database. And if the data doesn't follow the validation rules, the model will refuse to complete the save, but also keep track of the errors that it encountered so that we can review them or give the user a chance to fix them. There are 9 validation methods that we can use. The first one, validates presence of, we took a look at in the last chapter. We needed to use a very simple validation in order to take a look at form errors. And when we used it, we had validates presence of, and then a space, and then :name, basically a symbol for the name attribute. So that lets it know what attribute we want to validate the presence of. The validation also takes a second argument, which is a hash of options for configuring it. And all the validations work the same way. They take an attribute followed by a hash of options. Now, validates presence of makes sure that the attribute is not blank. And blank in Rails encompasses nil, false, an empty string, a string with only spaces in it, an empty array, and an empty hash. And if we have this validation on one of our models and we submit an attribute that's considered blank, then that model will be marked with an error saying that name can't be blank. Now, we can customize the last part of that message. Name is going to be whatever the attribute is, but the last part, can't be blank, we can configure by passing in message in the options hash. The next validation is validates length of. Here we're not just interested that there is a value, we're interested in how long the value is, how many characters it has. In this case, we have to pass in something to the options hash so it knows what we're looking for. So validates length of name, and then we'd say is, and we could pass in whatever the length ought to be. That would be if it was a precise length. Or we could pass in minimum if we want to make sure that it's above a certain number, or maximum if it's below a certain number. You can pass in both, minimum and maximum, to make sure it's between two numbers. Or, in that case, you could use the shorthand within, and in is just a synonym for it, within, and give it a range. So for example, instead of minimum 1, maximum 10, you could have within 1:10. Instead of a single message for validates length of, there are 3 different messages, one for when you're looking for a precise length, and one for when the value is too short or too long. We also have a validation for validates numericality of. Here we're making sure that something is a number, either an integer or a floating point number. And we can check not only that it is a number, but if we pass into the options hash equal to, we can make sure it's equal to a certain number, or greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, if we want to test any of those things. And we can pass in true or false to the only integer option if we don't want to allow floating point numbers, but only integers. In every case, the default message is not a number. The next validation is validates inclusion of. Here we have a list of choices, and we want to make sure that the value of this attribute is in that set of choices. So the option that we pass in is in, and you can pass in an enumerable object to it. Typically that's either an array or a range. And if it doesn't pass the validation, the message will say that this attribute is not included in the list. We have the opposite of that too with validates exclusion of. It does the exact same thing but makes sure that it's not in a list, and the default message is this attribute is reserved. We can take a look at the value of an attribute and validate its format. We can do that using a regular expression. So validates format of an attribute with, and then you pass in the regular expression. So for example, if you need a value to be in the format of 3 letters followed by 3 numbers followed by 3 more letters, well, you could write a regular expression that would make sure that it was in that format. And if not, it would fail the validation with the message, this attribute is invalid. Next, we have validates uniqueness of. This makes sure that the value is not already in the database. A classic case for this is username. So we want to make sure that a username can only exist one time in the database. So before we save the username John Doe to the database, we need to actually do a database query to see if there are any other John Does that are in there. So keep that in mind. Validates uniqueness of, unlike the other validations, will make a database call when it's doing its job. That's the only way it can know whether this value already exists. We can pass in an option for whether the check should be case sensitive, and you can also pass in one for scope. The idea here is that we might say John Doe is not allowed anywhere, and so we don't want to allow it at all. It's completely unique. Or we might say, well, it's unique only within a certain scope. So company ABC can have a John Doe, and company XYZ can also have a John Doe. In that case, the scope might be the company ID. What validates uniqueness of is doing is taking the column and using that in its query that it's constructing. And the message for that will be that this attribute has already been taken. The next one, validates acceptance of, honestly, I don't think is that tremendously useful. The idea here is that when we're filling out a form, we might want a user to just check a box agreeing to something, like the terms of service. Validates acceptance of makes sure that that checkbox got checked. It does one other thing for you besides that. Because it's something like the terms of service is something that we don't necessarily want to store in the database, we just want the person to agree to it, but we don't need to store that anywhere. If you don't have a column in your table for it, then validates acceptance of will create a virtual attribute and use that. So it will still have to have that value checked, but it won't bother saving it to the database. You can pass in the option accept, which is what value you're looking for. By default, that's going to be the string 1 because that's what the checkbox will send in the form. The next one has a very similar sounding name, but it does something very different. So validates acceptance of and validates confirmation of. Don't get those confused. The idea behind validates confirmation of is making sure that the user typed the data correctly by asking them to enter it a second time. So you've probably seen this before where it says enter your password and enter your password a second time, or enter your email address and enter your email address a second time, right? It does the same kind of virtual attribute that validates acceptance of does. We don't need to save their email confirmation to the database, so instead it just creates a virtual attribute and makes sure that that matches the original attribute. So for example, if we had validates confirmation of email, the virtual attribute would be called email confirmation. And then we could put that on our form and they would have to match up or it would fail the validation. Now there's one additional important point that you need to know about, which is that it only runs this validation if the confirmation attribute has been set to something. In other words, if you don't include it on your form field, then this validation won't run. Now that's a good thing because there may be other forms where we want to update other parts of this object and not deal with whatever this field is that we want to have confirmed. We wouldn't want our validation to stop everything from saving just because we didn't take the time to re-provide this confirmation again. Last of all, I just want to look at a couple of other global options that you can use. Most of these methods are going to accept the options for allow nil and allow blank. So if you want to allow it to skip the validation if it hasn't been submitted, or if you want to allow them to put in empty strings, well then you can use allow nil or allow blank. Now of course a method like validates presence of isn't going to allow you to skip blank because that negates its whole reason for existing, but almost all of the other ones will. There are two more important ones that you can pass in. One is for on. So you can say on save, on create, or on update. And that tells it when you want this validation to run. You may want to only run a validation for new records, in which case you would use on create. Or only on existing records that have already been stored in the database one time, well then we could run the validation only on update. Or save, which is the default, if we want to do it in both cases, both for create and update. And then last of all, we have if and unless. So you can use if and then give it a method name or unless and a method name. And this validation will only run if that method returns true or false. So we're going to need to define the method in our model, and that method will need to return true or false. The method can do absolutely anything you want, but it needs to return true or false to the validation. So that gives you a really good overview of validations. Let's go to the next movie and we can try them out on our application.